Well, good morning, my grandchildren. It's a beautiful day today and rained all night, but today's okay. And I thought we'd read another story in our storybook. This one is called Sleeping Beauty. I'm sure it's one that you've heard before, but perhaps not in the old time way that it was originally written. This is an old story from years ago. Sleeping Beauty. A king and a queen once reigned in a country great ways off, and there were in those days fairies. Now this king and queen had plenty of money and plenty of fine clothes and plenty of good things to eat and to drink. And though they had been married for many years, they had no children. This grieved them very much indeed, as the one thing they desired was to raise a family. And one day, as the queen was walking by the side of the river, she saw a poor little fish that had thrown itself out of the water and was laying gasping, nearly dead, on the bank. The queen took pity on the little fish and threw it back again into the river. But before it swam away, it lifted its head out of the water and it said, "I know that what your wish is, and it shall be fulfilled. In return for your kindness to me, you will soon have a daughter." What the little fish had foretold soon came to pass, and the queen had a beautiful little girl. The king announced that he would hold a great feast to show the child all the people in his land. So he invited his kinsmen, his nobles, his friends, his neighbors. But the queen said, "I shall have the fairies come too, that they might be kind and good to our little daughter." Now there were 13 fairies in the kingdom, but since the king and queen only had 12 golden dishes, they were forced to leave one of the fairies without inviting her. So the 12 fairies came, each with a high red cap on her head, red shoes and high heels on her feet, and a long white wand in her hand. And after the feast was over, they gathered round in a ring and gave all their best gifts to the little princess. One gave her goodness, another gave her beauty, another gave her riches, and so on, until she had all that was good in the world. And just as the 11th had given her blessing, a great noise was heard in the courtyard, and word was brought that the 13th fairy had come to the party as well. With a black cap on her head and black shoes on her feet and a broomstick in her hand, and presently she entered the dining room. Now since she had not been asked to the feast, she was very angry, and she scolded the king and the queen, and she set to work to take her revenge. She cried out, "The king's daughter shall, in her 15th year, be wounded by a spindle and fall down dead." And the whole company was horrified at the terrible prophecy. Then the 12th of the friendly fairies, who had not yet given her gift, came forward and said that the evil wish must come true and be fulfilled, but that she could soften its mischief. So her gift was that the king's daughter, when the spindle wounded her, would not really fall down dead, but would only fall asleep for 100 years. However, the king hoped to still save his daughter from all this threatened evil, so he ordered that the spindles in the kingdom should all be burnt. The princess grew, and all the gifts of the first 11 fairies were fulfilled. The princess was so beautiful and so well behaved and so good and so wise that everyone who knew her loved her. And it happened that on the very day that she was 15 years old, the king and queen were busily preparing for the party in the princess's honor, and she was left alone in the palace. So she roamed about by herself and looked at all the rooms and the chambers, until at last she came to an old tower, which there was a narrow staircase ending with a little door. In the door there was a golden key, and when she turned it, the door sprung open. There sat the old lady spinning very busily. "Why, good woman," said the princess, "what are you doing there?" "Spinning," said the old lady, and nodded her head, humming a tune, while buzz went the wheel and the yarn was being turned. "How pretty that little thing turns round," said the princess, and she took the spindle in her hand and began to try it, but scarcely had she touched it before the fairy's prophecy was fulfilled. The spindle wounded her, and she fell down lifeless on the ground. However, she was not dead. She had fallen asleep, a deep sleep, and she slept, and she slept. And as she slept, the king and the queen and all their courts fell asleep too. Even the cooks who were preparing the birthday feast slumbered over their sauces and sweet meats. And the horse slept in the stable, and the dogs slept in the court, and the pigeons on the housetop, and the flies on the walls. And a large hedge of thorns grew up around the palace, and every year it became higher and higher and thicker, until at last the whole palace was surrounded and hidden, so that not even the roof or the chimneys could be seen. But word spread through all the land of the beautiful Sleeping Beauty, for so the king's daughter was called, so that from time to time princes came and tried to break through the thicket into the palace. This, however, none of them could ever do. So after many years, there came a king's son into that land, and an old man told him of the story of the thicket of thorns, and how the beautiful palace was standing behind the thorns, and how a wonderful princess called Sleeping Beauty lay asleep with all her court. Then the young prince said, "I shall go and see this Sleeping Beauty." Now that very day, the 100 years had ended, and it was the princess's birthday. And so, as the prince came to the thicket, he saw nothing but beautiful flowering shrubs, through which he went with ease, and they shut in after him as thick as ever. And then finally he came to the palace, and there in the court lay the dogs asleep, the horses were standing in the stables asleep, and on the roof sat the pigeons fast asleep, and their heads were under their wings. And when he came into the palace, the flies were sleeping on the walls, the spit was standing still, the butler had a jug of ale to his lips, beginning to drink a draught, and the maid was with a fowl in her lap, ready to pluck it. Then he went on still further, and it was also still, and all was so still that he could hear every breath that he breathed, till at last he came to the old tower, and he opened the door of the little room, and there was Sleeping Beauty, fast asleep on the couch by the window. She looked so beautiful, he could not take his eyes off her. Here's a picture of the prince and Sleeping Beauty. So she looked so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off her, so he stooped down and gave her a kiss. The moment he kissed her, her eyes opened, and she awoke. And at the same time the king and the queen also awoke, and the court, and they gazed on one another with great wonder, and the horses shook themselves, and the dogs jumped up and began to bark, and the pigeons took their heads from under their wings, and flew into the fields. And the flies on the walls began buzzing, and the fire in the kitchen blazed up. Round and round and round went the jack, and round went the spit, with the goose for the king's dinner upon it. And as soon as Sleeping Beauty saw the prince, she fell immediately in love with him, and of course he was already in love with her, and so the two were married. And a wedding feast was given, and they lived happily ever after, all the long days of their lives. So that's the original story of Sleeping Beauty. I hope you've enjoyed hearing some stories from Grandpa. I like these old stories that maybe you're familiar with, maybe you aren't. Well, Grandpa's got to go get some work done down in the shop, and I've got kids to take care of, and lots of life to live and do. And the good Lord has blessed me in many ways. And you, my grandchildren, are one of those blessings that God has given me. Thank you so much for the love and the joy that we get to share together. Take care of yourselves. Until next time, we can read another story. Bye.